Just a little over a week ago, Square Enix had revealed to us the launch trailer to their upcoming mobile game called Final Fantasy VII Ever Crisis. Now, it has shown off quite a few tidbits of never before seen context of a much younger Sephiroth as a hero that we always heard and mentions of but never seen any context. While many fans are excited about these new details regarding Sephiroth, for me, it just reminds me of how much I hate the Final Fantasy VII Compilation and what it has done to its world and stories before it existed. Now, I may get a lot of hate for this video, but I just want to talk a bit about or rant about why I hate the Final Fantasy VII Compilation. So before we begin, make sure you hit the subscribe button, that notification bell for more gaming content here on this channel. Now, I know it's been said to death already. Final Fantasy VII is one of my favorite Final Fantasy entries of all time, besides Final Fantasy IX and Tactics. For most, it was their first title that introduced them to JRPGs, so the game has this very special place in my heart. I love its characters, the gameplay, and most importantly, its story and world building. The party of Final Fantasy VII felt so personal to me as a kid. It was so hard to say goodbye to them by the time the credits come rolling onto the screen. Yeah, I was that invested, more invested than I ever was when it comes to video games in the early 90s. Cloud had ranked on my list of best video game characters alongside Link, Sonic, Ness, and Ramza, and the list goes on. What made Final Fantasy VII so impactful for me on an emotional level is the fact that the story concluded in such a mysterious way. You see what appears to be Red 13 and his offsprings pairing off to what looks like a decaying Midgard or a reactor. And that was it. The developers left you wondering what exactly happened, and it was left to the fans' interpretation, which I love about most video games of the past. No matter how much I fantasize, no pun intended, about the continuation of Final Fantasy VII's story and its world, at that time we weren't getting anything else. You know what? I was completely fine about that. A series remained legendary when it ends on a high note. It is forever remembered for what it was and not what it could have been. The game will live on through fans' speculations and theories. Now, some things were left unexplained, which created the mystery and excitement for fans as they pick apart context and every detail that the story may have implied. Each time you replayed the game, you may pick up context that you may have missed your first couple of playthroughs, but that was the wonders of Final Fantasy VII and many other games of this era. You had to live with the fact that no matter how much you wanted certain fates for some characters to happen, there was nothing you can do about it. No matter if you wanted a perfect ending for them, it just wasn't going to happen. Yeah, and I was also okay with that. Then comes Final Fantasy VII Compilation. Now, reminding you, I was in 4th grade when Final Fantasy VII released, and by the time Final Fantasy VII Advent Children was announced, I had already begun my freshman year of college. I was like many other Final Fantasy VII fans who were excited about the announcement of a sequel to Final Fantasy VII's story. And on top of that, a bunch of content regarding Final Fantasy VII will also be in development. Despite me being content with not having any more Final Fantasy VII content, the fanboy inside me was jumping for joy at the fact is that we're getting more Final Fantasy VII greatness moving forward. I was so naive, and I thought that this was something that I really wanted at the time. When Final Fantasy VII Advent Children first released, me and my bros at college all gathered together in the lobby of our dorm and watched it for the very first time. We were going nuts over the fact is that our favorite characters will be voiced for the first time ever, fully voiced. We get to see the world of Final Fantasy VII in a different way, unlike everything we've ever seen before or anything of that matter. We praised it, and over time, after rewatching it over and over, the honeymoon period began to fade out. Then I began to notice a few things about Advent Children that I didn't like so much. One were the interpretation of the characters, more specifically Cloud. They made him emo, dark, and brooding, when in fact by the time you reach the end of the original game, he had already came to terms who he was and became a much more confident Cloud. It was like this character had regressed, and let's not forget about Reno and Rude, which they were pretty much made into comic relief characters with a conscience, when they weren't originally like that. Then of course, the remnants of Sephiroth. I hated every aspect of this because by the time Sephiroth returned, we were essentially retreading the same waters once again. It was a recreation of the last battle between Cloud and Sephiroth in the original game, and also ended the very same exact way. Sephiroth's return added nothing new to the story. It was almost as if it was an obligation to have him in there for fan service. The story would have been much bolder if he was not included and just kept the trio as the main antagonist. For me, the movie have not aged well at all. The fight sequences, the more I look at it, is a bit more ridiculous over time. I have not revisited the film in a long time and probably won't anytime soon. And dear God, help us. Square Enix decided to give us a third-person shooter RPG that focused mainly on Vincent Valentine as the protagonist. Now, he's a cool character. The game is called Dirge of Cerberus. Now, Square is just complete ass when it comes to creating anything other than a traditional JRPG. Their fighting games were awful, and now they were trying to create a third-person shooter with RPG elements. Here, they wanted to flesh out Vincent more as a character, since in the original game, if you don't know, he was a secret character with little backstory about him outside of the side quests that center around this character. Not much else was said, but we did learn in the original that he had some connection to Hojo, which is what this game has decided to focus on. We were introduced to new characters within Soldier known as Deep Ground, which were some of the worst additions to the Final Fantasy VII lore. It ended on a cliffhanger with another character who appeared to be sprouting one wing similar to Sephiroth, which made me go like, what the fuck is this? So wait a minute, there is someone other than Sephiroth who has one wing. I wasn't excited. It just meant that Sephiroth was no longer special. There's nothing special to him anymore when there is someone else out there who exists just like him. But the game that really broke me for sure when it came to Final Fantasy VII and its lore is Final Fantasy VII Crisis Core. Now, I know there's some people out there that really enjoyed the hell out of this game. Kudos to you. It's not a knock or a rag on you guys. If you enjoy it, that's fine. But this game was where it focused more on Zack. He take the center stage as the main protagonist. This game is what made me finally realize that I was being milked as a fan. Dirge of Cerberus was a bad game, but Crisis Core added to the bad storytelling and lore that was introduced to the overarching plot of Final Fantasy VII. A lot of retconning had to be done in order for any of this to make sense. The combat was bad, voice acting was questionable, and the introduction of Genesis was the worst thing they could have done to the story. His inclusion rewrites a lot of story elements of the original game. Why was there never any mentions of him in the original game? He even appeared in the scene where Sephiroth discovered what Jenova actually is, which was never true in the original game. It felt like the more we were introduced to new story elements and explanations to aspects of the game's lore through the compilation, the more it diluted the context of the original story found in the PS1 release. Then suddenly the compilation had discontinued after Crisis Core. In my opinion, despite the many fans who enjoyed it for what it was, to many, or to me, it killed Final Fantasy VII so much that it pretty much essentially disappeared, because if it was successful, I don't think they would have stopped. Square Enix would have probably kept shitting out more games within the compilation if it was a true success. After that, Final Fantasy VII and its compilation just disappeared. Sure, fans continued to talk about it within individual communities, but that was pretty much it. But it didn't take long for many of us to begin talking about a Final Fantasy VII remake, now that the PS3 had revealed the future of the Final Fantasy series with Final Fantasy XIII. It pretty much had me hyped for a potential to revisit the original game, but with new generation or next generation technology at the time. And Square Enix even doubled down by presenting a PS3 tech demo of Final Fantasy VII. This was it. This was something that we wanted, a true remake of our beloved game. Everything we experienced growing up, but with better graphics, something close to what we've seen in Average Children. But nothing came of it, and for years we wondered and waited some kind of news for a potential remake, and then it finally happened in 2015. My prayers was finally answered. I finally get to relive the vision which was Final Fantasy VII, but this time in all its next-gen glory. This was also the perfect time to introduce the game to a new generation of gamers and watch them become amazed the same way I was back when it released in 1997. But boy, was I wrong. We finally get a bit of detail much later that the game was going through some development issues with CyberConnect, and that Square Enix had to end up taking the game and bringing it in-house to continue to develop the game. Not only that, the game was going to be broken into multiple parts. The interviews then mentioned that the game also will fit into the compilation of Final Fantasy VII. This was when my heart dropped, but the fan in me also set me in denial mode of what's to come when it comes to the remake. We were showing all the familiar set pieces found in the original game. As the game began to come closer to launch, the final trailer revealed other elements that weren't found in the original. So I said to myself, and I say to you guys too, is this a remake? But I do expect some changes when it comes to a remake. Some changes and elements have to be added into a remake. It comes with the territory of what a remake fundamentally is. But the game finally released in 2020. My brothers finally get a chance to play the game. They finally get a chance to play the game that I grew up playing as a young boy. They even convinced their friends to go pick up the game. I boot up the game and it's graced with the high fidelity visuals and way better interpretations of the characters. It had the hallmarks of what I wanted in a remake. Sure, the Arbiters of Fate weren't in the original, but maybe they are going to add some additional context to the main plot of the original game. But nope. As we head near to the final chapter of the game becomes more and more unrecognizable. Then we were hit with a revelation clip.
What the hell did I just see?
A glimpse of tomorrow if we fail here today.
Yeah, that's right. The original game was a bad outcome if Fate was not defeated. It pretty much shitted on the original game, the game that I grew up with. And now my brothers are being introduced to this and they don't even understand because they used to watch me play it as a kid, so they have some context, but even they were baffled. And then their friends didn't understand what was going on because this was not the Final Fantasy VII that I remember. And now this new audience walks into this game and are confused and wanting to know, like, okay, what's going on here? That's when I was no longer delusional when it came to this remake. This was in fact another game within the Final Fantasy VII compilation. This meant that we weren't going to get a true remake of the original story. In fact, the original story, by what this game is inferring, is a bad future or outcome that needs to be prevented. And then the final icing on the cake was the early reveal of this asshole, Zack. I never hated Zack as a character in the original, but ever since Ever Crisis was released, I began to dislike this character more and more. Because Crisis Core was the game that represented the downturn for Final Fantasy VII's original story, in my personal opinion. It encompasses everything I hated about the compilation, and now he's back in a much different context. Zack is now alive, and all this did was make me think that the developers wanted to cash in on the fan community of Final Fantasy VII. Zack has a pocket community of fans who just love the character and even write fan stories and fiction of him surviving events of Final Fantasy VII Crisis Core. Let's not talk about the shipping community. That's a whole nother spectrum right there. But now this asshole's alive, and Square Enix is planning on milking the fuck out of the fans moving forward into the next two entries of Final Fantasy VII Remake Trilogy. The developers didn't plan to keep him alive and not do nothing with this guy. Square Enix wasn't finished there, we just getting started. Now we are giving more Final Fantasy VII content through the upcoming mobile game releases called Final Fantasy VII Ever Crisis, which will remilk the entire Final Fantasy VII compilation, but through episodic releases. More context is being added to the game's lore with each title, more specifically the origin of Sephiroth. This is where I have a problem with the compilation. In fact, it also taught me much about the concept of some things are better left unsaid. So what does that mean? Well, for example, Sephiroth. What made Sephiroth such an interesting antagonist in Final Fantasy VII was the fact is that not much was known about him. Even in the original game booklet, mostly everything was a question mark. Even as a kid, I was intrigued. He didn't even have a character model like the rest of the cast in the manual. Just a picture of his face, and that was it. We were only told about him through small talk at the beginning of the game. His name was a throwaway to me because he didn't provide any importance to the story at first. The game tricked you into believing that President Shinra would be the main antagonist throughout the entire game. But by the time you reach the end, Sephiroth was the villain the entire time. He was a mystery. We were only told that he was the hero who fought in the Wutai War. But guess what? That was good enough. Everything else about the character was purposely left a mystery or missing context. It made his character so much more bigger than life. When you first had Sephiroth added to your party during the Calm flashback, you had an opportunity to witness his true power. He's everything the legends had said about him. Then he finally snaps once he finds out his true origin and a bit of backstory of Jenova as a concept. When his theme song played back when I was a young boy, I was petrified. He was a true menace that could never cross paths with. And I even said to myself, if we ever have to fight this guy, and after displaying his full strength when he was in your party, how can we fight someone like that? He even killed Aerith, and I hated him for it. This dude became a villain that I had held to such high regards. He was a complicated character due to not much context about him. Even his final form, he had one wing. Fans didn't understand what that meant. For me, I thought it was just an aesthetic choice from the developers. But that one wing meant something to his character design, because you see it on every form of advertisement. It became synonymous with the character. That's what made Sephiroth such an interesting character, because the developers left these concepts and ideas to our own interpretation. For all we know, the wing may just have been a design choice and nothing more. But then here comes the compilation, where we are introduced to Project S and Project G in Final Fantasy Crisis Core, which is Project Sephiroth and Project Genesis. Now, developers are giving us explanations behind these concepts that were once left to its own interpretation. Not only that, we find out that Sephiroth was not the only experiment. Now we get introduced to Angel and Genesis, who also dons the one wing. Now the one-way concept has been diluted, in my personal opinion. There's nothing special about Sephiroth and his character anymore, now that we know that there are other characters who exist just like him. Now we're getting even more context of Sephiroth, even within Ever Crisis, a much younger version of him. But why? Why do we need to know about the younger Sephiroth? The mysteriousness behind this character made him a much better character. Why does everything need an explanation? Zack was a much better character in the original. He was the vehicle behind Cloud's growth and development as a character. His death had a purpose in the original story. The mystery of who Zack was as a character made him a much better character. The original game showed us how Cloud was similar to Zack. Even Aerith told him that he reminded her of a soldier she once knew. Tifa was secretive about Zack. Hell, you had to find a secret cutscene to find out how he died and left Cloud the Buster Sword. That was perfect for his character. He was remembered for his sacrifice and pushed Cloud as a character that everyone in gaming culture loved till this very day. And then here comes the compilation. We not only get a full context of who Zack is, but now we get context behind the Buster Sword, something that was also a mystery, and I preferred it remained that way. So some mediums within gaming and entertainment is best left for the viewers and fans to come up with and interpret on their own. This compilation lays out everything for the fans, and to me, some of this isn't really that interesting. It dilutes the overall experience of Final Fantasy VII's lore with all this added context when the original stood on its own without it. Now you have people speculating whether or not Glenn, who's one of the main characters in Ever Crisis, people are speculating whether or not if that's Cloud's father, and I hope to God he isn't, because that is more unneeded context, something that we don't need to an already milked series. I know most of you will type in the comment sections, then go play the original, because it still exists. But here's my problem with that. See, my problem with the remake and the compilation overall, a remake is supposed to be the definitive experience of the original. Perfect example. Resident Evil 1 remake is a true remake. It's built anew. It takes everything from the original game and rebuild it from the ground up with new technology and additional features to meet modern sensibilities. And if they had to remove something from what was in the original and replace with something brand new, it will only replace it if it's something that's going to prove to be much better than what the original had to offer. there's literally no reason to go back to play the original PS1 version of Resident Evil unless you want to speedrun. But besides that, the remake improves the original and add more content to an already awesome experience. It's the definitive way to play Resident Evil 1. No one will ever suggest you go play the original PS1 version of the game. This is a remake. This is the definitive experience of Resident Evil 1, the game. Resident Evil fans are eating right now when it comes to these remakes. But what I do find funny about Square Enix is how they muddle what a remake actually is. On one hand, you have Alive Alive remake that released just last year, and it's a remake. It's built anew from the ground up. It's pretty much one-to-one to the original game, and it's a great game. Then you have Trials of Mana remake, which is one-to-one, a remake, but it's made in 3D and have a lot of modern quality of life additions to meet modern gaming sensibilities. This is also another great title, by the way. Then you have Star Ocean 2 remake and Super Mario RPG remake, which are both remakes with some additions, and they were just announced recently. So why is it when it comes to Final Fantasy VII Compilation and its quote-unquote remakes, all of a sudden the lines are blurred? Final Fantasy Crisis Core Reunion is somehow a remaster instead of a remake, even though there's improvements in visuals, there's gameplay modifications that actually makes it much more accessible compared to how horrible it was on the PSP. You have new voice actors, and the story is one-to-one, and yet it's still considered a remaster. How does that make sense? But then we look at Final Fantasy VII Remake, where the story isn't one-to-one. They are completely changing everything in terms of storytelling and its themes, and everything is interpreted differently than the original. And somehow this is called a remake. No, this is not a remake. This is a reimagine, if anything else. They're taking the same characters and aesthetics, and they're using it to tell a whole totally different story. Using familiar set pieces. That's a reimagine. That's not a remake. But we are told by Square Enix and so many of these Final Fantasy fans, these new Final Fantasy fans, that this game is a remake. This only happens to the Final Fantasy VII brand, because the rumor is Final Fantasy IX Remake, that has been rumored, because so far the leaks has been true. Everything that's been leaked out has been released so far. So we've been told that Final Fantasy IX Remake is supposed to happen, and it's going to remain 100% faithful to the original game, but with some improvements. And yet Square Enix could not do the same with Final Fantasy VII.
Square Enix games in there have been confirmed or even came out by now, except for Final Fantasy IX Remake and Final Fantasy Tactics Remaster. I will say I heard very recently, once again, Final Fantasy IX Remake is real.
What I hate most is that some of these so-called OG fans retroactively changed their stance on what they wanted from a Final Fantasy VII Remake, as if they were already always on board with a different take on Final Fantasy VII story. When we first saw the PS3 tech demo, everyone said that this is what they want from a remake, the same game and story with modern improvements. No one was saying back then that they wanted all this fan fiction nonsense found in Final Fantasy VII Remake story, but now for some strange reason these people are pretending that's what they always wanted. And that's what I find so funny about this community, more specifically the Final Fantasy VII community. And then you have others who are saying that this Final Fantasy VII Remake is the definitive Final Fantasy VII experience. And no, I don't agree with that. Final Fantasy VII PS1 shouldn't be something that you direct players to if Final Fantasy VII Remake is supposed to be the definitive experience. You shouldn't have to direct me to say, hey, go play the original if you still want to play the original because it still exists. No, the definitive experience means that I shouldn't have to play the original no more, because this remake does everything better and improve upon the remake. So this right here is the definitive experience. Yes, it will always remain in history, the original one, for the contributions that it had. But in the future, no one will ever have to refer to the original. They will just refer to a remake that is the definitive experience. And in my personal opinion, Final Fantasy VII isn't the definitive experience, because the compilation, as I said before, has destroyed and diluted the Final Fantasy VII's lore and everything about the brand because of all the nonsense, the retconning, and just the milking of the series altogether. It just frustrates me, and this is the reason why every time I see Zack, and and even when I see Ever Crisis right now, and seeing a young Sephiroth, seeing the introduction to all these new characters, it just reminds me of how much they're really diluting the original game. Like you would never be able to see the original game the way it is, because all this is supposed to fit in the world of Final Fantasy VII, and I'm just not feeling it. And that pretty much wraps this video. I definitely want to hear your thoughts in the comment sections below. Do you just think that I'm just overreacting, or do you think I just need to shut up, or do you connect, or do you agree with me? Do you have the same sentiments when it comes to Final Fantasy VII and its compilation? Let me know in the comment section below. If you like the video, hit that like button, hit that subscribe button for more gaming content here on this channel. This is MugenLord signing off. I'll see you game fiends later. Peace out.